Welcome to this webinar. My name is Jesper Nytoft Bergman, and I'm the Director and Executive Dean here at AVT Business School. And I'll be your host for the next 30 minutes. So after a short introduction, our main speaker, Gabrielle Adams, will talk about leading and motivating in a crisis. From a position of management, this is a difficult time. It may seem tricky to think about how you can move from addressing the needs of the now while preparing for the next with little or no data at all. But as futurist and author Bob Johansen says, it won't be getting any easier. Leaders must accept this new reality. He adds that managers and leaders need vision, provide understanding, and communicate clarity to lead and motivate people. We are also in the middle of a dramatic change in our working habits. Many of us have to lead remotely and thereby missing the power of physical presence and group dynamics. Gabrielle Adams will share her perspectives on how leaders must address this challenge. With her deep knowledge in psychological mechanics, she will share her insights on how you keep your teams and people motivated and focused on your organizational mission. Gabrielle Adams is with us live from the US. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Public Policy and Psychology at the University of Virginia. Gabby has a PhD from Stanford University, and prior to joining the University of Virginia, she was a faculty member at London Business School and Harvard Business School. So welcome to you, Gabby, and thank you for joining us in a discussion about how we lead and motivate in a crisis.
Jesper, thank you so much for inviting me to give this webinar. It was a great chance for me to reflect on what the literature has said so far about how to lead and motivate in a crisis. And there is a lot of great research that's been done. And so that is sort of the basis of what I'm going to be sharing with you all today. I'm glad that you are all here and that you can join me for this. In the chat, and also you will see up on the screen, a link to a short survey. It's a short reflection, tinyurl.com/AVT webinar. At some point in the next 5 to 10 minutes, I would suggest that you go ahead and fill this out, and I will be debriefing the results of it near the end of the webinar today. Also, you should know that I am currently sheltering in place in Charlottesville, Virginia, with a 2.5-year-old and a 4-month-old, so you might hear some background noise. They will be cries, sometimes of joy, sometimes of sadness, and hopefully it will not be too distracting for you. All right. So just by way of background, I am a social psychologist, and I have a degree in a field called organizational behavior. So that means that a lot of what I'm going to be sharing with you is based on research. It's based on experiments, on studies that have been conducted, on many data points. So unlike other people who teach management and leadership, you know, from maybe their own personal experience or from their experience in an organization, this is something that I kind of study from a quantitative experimental perspective on a daily basis. Research has slowed, but it is not completely stopped. And in fact, there's a lot of great research going on right now about how to lead through the pandemic that we're currently experiencing. And so hopefully in another few months, I'll be able to share some of that research as well. But here is kind of what we know so far. And that's what I'm going to share with you today. What I'd like for you to focus on, and what the theme of today is, how can you improve your life? How can you make it better during this time? Okay, and I'm going to kind of come back to this question throughout the webinar as we go, but it's just something that I'd like for you to keep in the back of your minds. We are going through an unprecedented crisis right now, and what the research has to say about pandemics is not a lot. As my associate dean sort of quipped the other day, he said, well, this is my first pandemic. And that's true for all of us. None of us have ever been through a crisis quite like this. At the same time, we know that there are crises that affect organizations all the time, from ethical scandals to mistakes or failures to scandals at the top of leadership teams. And so it's that literature that I'm going to be drawing on today to talk about how a crisis unfolds and how we can all get through it and even use this as an opportunity to improve our lives. Crises unfold actually in fairly sort of linear and similar ways. Usually what happens is that there's a sense-making period after a crisis where people, members of an organization, and I think, you know, even now as this pandemic unfolds, many of us are taking time to think about what has happened, what is happening. We are on the news, reading the news constantly. We are with our families. We're trying to sort of protect our own health, the health of the people around us. And so there's a lot of what scholars would call sense making going on right now. This will soon, if it has not already, unfold in sort of a damage control period. And I think that you could think of damage control certainly as the social distancing measures that we are taking, but also in terms of the individual measures that we as employees, as leaders, and as, you know, the heads of our own families take to ensure that this crisis doesn't impact us in a way that is crippling in the long run. And so much of what we're doing right now is in that sort of sense-making and damage control phase. My understanding is, of course, that Denmark is fairly far ahead of the US. Here we are still all sheltering in place. We have a very divided country on how to approach the crisis. But hopefully we will soon, as a world, and certainly no matter what country you're in, shift into recovery mode. And certainly some other countries have already shifted into that mode already. Recovery mode really looks like, if you could imagine sort of the lifetime of a crisis, it's that part at which you sort of start to see the uptick or the upswing as things start to normalize. And I recognize that in this sense, normalize is kind of a loaded word. It's not clear that things will ever get completely back to normal. I think we've learned a lot from this crisis. And so recovery, I think the standard that we want to hold ourselves to is not getting back to normal or getting back to the way things were, but really kind of reopening things and figuring out what the new normal is going to be. Finally, the last stage in a crisis is what can we learn from all of this? And I think that this cycle really speaks to not just how we're going to keep going through this COVID crisis. You know, there's still going to be upticks in the prevalence of the disease, but also how we think about what we learn from pandemics in general. Many researchers are drawing on what we know from the 1918 flu pandemic that was so devastating. And there's a lot we can learn from history. There's a lot that healthcare workers can learn from treatments. They're learning on the fly in hospitals every day. And so this is a period that you know, we're hoping to get to soon. None of this proceeds linearly, right? So we can skip back and forth between these four stages. We're often doing parts of all four at once. So it would be nice if crises unfolded linearly like this. They don't, but these are kind of the four buckets or four ways to think about them. Why should we talk about leadership during a crisis? I think it's important to be really explicit about this. We know we often have the answer about what the other end of a crisis looks like. We often know what the goal is. I think in this case, it's certainly to have herd immunity, it's to have a robust economy, it's to try to have teams and organizations that start to function again, businesses that reopen. But it's not enough to just say that's where we want to be. We have to really think about the process that it will take to get there. And so we need leadership not just because we need people to say, okay, here's what the goal is. We need leadership because we have to get people there. We have to get them to buy into the process that it will take to get there. It's not just enough to have the right answer. We have to also be willing to do the work behind getting people to that end state, whatever it looks like. There are pretty sad stories about what can happen if we don't have leadership in times of crisis, if we don't have people who are really pushing a group or a team along. Back in 1981, there was the first ever incident of the HIV virus being transmitted by blood transfusion in a hospital in San Francisco. And it actually took 4 years for blood banks to start screening for the presence of their virus in blood donations, right? And so this is an example of how, even if I know what the goal is, which is to get blood banks to screen for transfusions and so on and so forth, it doesn't mean that people are actually going to do that. They might have the right answer, but what they need is leadership to get them to that end goal. Right? How do you get from 1981 to 1985, where blood banks actually are screening for the presence of the virus in all blood donations? That's a failure of leadership, right? To overcome the strength of the blood banks who have government and politicians on their side, even though they know that the virus is floating around, we need people to not just see what the right answer is, but to actually get them into a point where they're adopting it. So some of the things that I want to talk about today for the remainder of our time are how to lead through a crisis, right? What should we think about? What are some of the things that we can do? Certainly, it's important for leaders to display competence and expertise. And for those of you who are responsible for managing teams, groups, organizations, this is a time when people will look to you to display strength. But it's also a time when people will look to you to display humility and to acknowledge when you don't always have the answer. And so that's when the rest of these other factors come into the mix. So certainly displaying competence, displaying expertise, leaders are going to be closely watched right now. But above and beyond showing how competent you are, demonstrating your trustworthiness, reacting appropriately and emotionally to your employees and to the crisis, motivating your employees, and then taking time to care for other people as well as yourself are all going to be critical to getting through a crisis. All right. So that first pillar, so how to demonstrate trustworthiness. Think for a moment about what people mean when they say that someone is trustworthy, right? And it can mean a variety of different things. Scholars have actually broken this down into 3 factors or 3 components. When people say that someone is trustworthy, one of the things that they mean is that this person has the ability to deliver or follow through when I need them to. Right? And that really speaks to the skills that you have that enable you to have influence, to be competent, to be an expert in a particular domain. So when I say that I trust someone, I know that they are going to be able to follow through with very little guidance, right? That can be one thing that I mean when I say that I trust someone. Another thing that I might mean is how much I think that this person has benevolent intentions or positive intentions toward other people, and in particular toward myself. So when I choose to trust someone, what I might mean when I say that is that I think that this person in general is a good person who has positive intentions toward me, who's not going to hurt me, who wants to help me. The final facet of what we mean when we say that someone is trustworthy is that they have integrity, that they are likely to, in our minds, adhere to values, standards, and principles. And sometimes we mean some combination of these three things or all of these things. For leaders to demonstrate trustworthiness in a crisis, we need to be thinking about demonstrating all of these things, right? Not just competence, not just expertise, but also that you have positive intentions to help, and that you are likely to adhere to your organization's values, standards, principles, and moral standards that you've already set forth. Right, so it's important, I think, for us to know that these are the things that people are thinking of when they evaluate our trustworthiness as leaders. When we evaluate others' trustworthiness as leaders, this is also something to keep in mind. What do we mean when we say that a leader is trustworthy? Which one of these factors do we have in mind? All right. Right now, people are going through some of the greatest change in their lives that they will ever experience. If they have not contracted the disease, then certainly they have completely changed the way that they do work. They're working from home. Many times they're not even able to work. They're trying to care for others. They're trying to parent. They may have elderly parents. They are trying to figure out, how to source scarce resources. In the US here, we have a run on a lot of goods and supplies that are not widely available, and so we're having to make do with alternatives. People, in short, are incredibly stressed and incredibly anxious, and as they attempt to go about their work lives, we should recognize as leaders that this is the case, and therefore what we need to do is we need to react appropriately and respond in a way that is the opposite of being an emotional robot. Right? Now is the time for compassion, for empathy and sympathy, and for perspective taking as people figure out how to navigate this very challenging time. One way that we can think about how to respond is how you would expect other people to respond to you. What would you want other people to do? So engaging in a little bit of perspective taking can often help you figure out what the right response is. An employee comes to you and says, hey, look, I'm not able to get very much work done because I'm concerned about my elderly mother. I haven't been able to see her in a month and a half, and isolation is not going well. Think about how would you respond? How would you want someone to respond if that was your case? Right? If that was your situation. And then try to muster sort of that compassion for your employee, right? What is it that they need to be able to get through this? What kind of support can you provide? Even if you can't provide any kind of actual, support like time off or anything like that, which hopefully we could, but even if we couldn't, sometimes just providing a helpful sort of listening ear can be what people need and what people look to from their team leaders. And direct supervisors. Some of my own research on apologies in the face of crises suggests that you need to show emotion that is congruent with the situation. So this research was done not just on, certainly it was not done on pandemics, but it was done in the aftermath of corporate scandals and how organizations can recover from them. People who got on video and apologized for what their organization had done, so CEOs, who apologized and looked happy, investors were less confident in their organization than investors who got on and showed that they were contrite, that they were remorseful, and that they were sad. So it's important to show emotion that's not just broad emotion, but that is tailored and that is appropriate and normative to the situation. So this is some of the data from our study. We looked at, I think it was 20 or 30 corporate scandals, and we looked at how CEOs apologized, and we coded their facial expressions. And when they expressed happiness compared to sadness, they were perceived to be less sincerely remorseful. People had less confidence in the performance of their company. And then we looked at how much people expected their company would perform well after the apology, and that was significantly lower when they expressed happiness compared to when they expressed sincere remorse. Okay. Motivating others, right now, we have to strike an appropriate balance between authoritarian and participative leadership. Authoritarian leadership is really about directing and controlling activities with very little input from your employees. Participative leadership invites input from others, provides information, and is democratic. We often don't have the time to be effective participative leaders because it takes time to survey others and to get their opinions. But right now, it's important more than ever for employees to feel like they have a voice, to feel like they have autonomy, for them to own their own goals. And so it's important to kind of provide time to be a democratic leader. We have to sort of strike the right balance between authoritarian and participative leadership. Finally, I want to end with that theme that I've been talking about, which is how would you improve your life and how can you help to improve other people's lives? In caring for others, right now, there's never been a crisis that didn't disproportionately affect the most vulnerable members of society. And we know that that's the case. Certainly here in the US, there are great health disparities for Black Americans compared to white Americans. In terms of recovery, who's likely to recover, there are likely to be disparities there. It's important during this time to check in with your employees, to care for them, to show that you compare. So going back to that theme of compassion and empathy, leaders are going to need to really step up at this point. Consider who's being disproportionately affected in your organization. One article that I read recently that's really has sort of jived with the way that I think about this crisis suggests that the coronavirus crisis smashes up the bargain that so many dual earner couples have made in the developed world. That bargain is that we can both work because someone else is looking after our children, and instead couples have to decide which one of them will take the hit. So recognize that, you know, your employees are struggling. They're struggling to parent. They're struggling to be sons and daughters with their own families, to take care of those who need it. And this is a time now more than ever, I think, to be mindful and cognizant of the ways in which our employees are affected. We want to think beyond our employees to other members of societies as well. What can your organization do to help? Right. At this time, if you've not already done it, there is a tiny URL in the chat, tinyurl.com/AVT webinar. That's tinyurl.com/AVT webinar. Take a few minutes to respond to that and submit your answers. And what I'd like to do is just very briefly talk about some of the results of that survey. My colleagues and I are trying to understand how people can improve their lives and the ways in which people think about improvement. And so you'll notice in that survey, one of the things that we asked you to do is to think about what are, you know, a few things that you could do, up to 10 things to make your life better at this time. How to care for yourself, how to manage your own stress. I'll be interested to see the answers in real time. Most people associate improvement with adding things, you know, new friends, new experiences, a new product, more features on that product, and so on and so forth. My hope is that this crisis has made us realize that actually there are things that we can get rid of from our lives that would also make our lives better. So thinking about how to improve our lives through subtraction. This is research that's under review, so I can't talk about it in depth, but the early kind of results suggest that we tend not to think about ways we can improve our lives through subtraction. We almost always think about and associate improvement with adding things. But think about things that are gone from your life that actually have made your life better. Negative relationships, unnecessary subscriptions, tasks or chores that you thought were onerous. Hopefully that has helped with this self-care process. Okay, in the remaining time left, I'd like to sort of understand what questions you have and see if I can address them. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to read what's coming through on the chat. I'll take a few minutes to read that, and then I'll try to pick out a few themes and answer what I can in the, it seems like 5 or so minutes that we have remaining.
Thank you, Gabby. And I think one of the questions that's coming out is when you're working in a large organization and you might be sitting in middle management. I think that's often a situation that people could find themselves in, that they're giving directions from above and they have to communicate it further down. And without, again, little or no data at this point, it might be difficult to lead or to motivate people even at this day and age. So how would you go about that if you kind of feel dependent on information coming from above, but maybe nothing is coming at all, but you still have to, take care of your employees as well?
Yeah, that's so hard, because what it does is it puts you in this really tough and awkward position of needing to communicate information to your employees and yet not having that information. And so that is often the plight of middle managers in generally, and it's certainly exacerbated during a crisis, during a time like this. Certainly, it just means that you have, it makes your life harder, right? Because what you have to do is you have to go after that information. From your senior leadership team. You have to say, hey, look, I need some answers here. Here's what my employees are concerned about. So your role as a middle manager right now is to be that line of communication between upper management and the people that you supervise. Trying to find answers would be the one thing. The second thing would be feeding back to your employees. Look, I'm trying to get answers. I don't know yet. This is really hard. I'm just as frustrated as you are, and I'm hoping that we can get answers soon. But in the absence of I think the fact that everyone is currently trying to find out what those answers are, I think a little patience is always required, but your job is sort of to really push people to be patient and also to try to get answers for them. So you are that line of communication. That's the most critical thing right now. We certainly have that in my own experience right now. So we have faculty, we have our deans, and then we have university leadership as well. Deans are like the people who are responsible for getting information from the university level all the way down to the faculty and the students in the schools. And that's a really tough position because they may be waiting for information from the university. The university is trying to make decisions as quickly as possible. And we're all sitting here waiting to figure out what's happening.
Another question that came through the chat is also that people react very differently to this situation. So how do you handle when you got a mix of people that are fighting the situation or the crisis that we're in? So should you address them in the same way, or how would you approach that?
I think good managers and good leaders always tailor their responses to the extent possible, checking in individually with employees rather than using a blanket approach. Kind of that high touch situation is going to be critical now more than ever to help employees feel heard, to help them feel like their individual situations are being understood. There's nothing that can signal compassion and empathy like feeling like you've been listened to. And so using a one-size-fits-all approach is not going to generate that sense of I've been heard. It means that managers have to spend more time now more than ever checking in with employees, making sure they're doing okay. What you can't do, you probably should not do, is attempt to just say, look, I'm here if you need me. Otherwise, I'm assuming that you are all doing well. That's probably not an approach that's going to work well.
All right, thank you, Kevin. In terms of working remotely, how do you actually create enthusiasm? Would you suggest when you maybe? I guess the question is around where you normally are together in the office, and now you sit scattered all around. So how do you make sure that it's energized enough, your team?
That's really hard to do. And I think, the research is still out, but what you're talking about is how do we preserve a positive sort of employee climate, and how do we continue to motivate and hold employees responsible? And again, here I think is a great time for individual check-ins. One company that I am an advisor for does a weekly check-in with all of their employees where everyone goes around and talks about a highlight of their week, which I think is a really nice idea. Trying to preserve as much as possible the rituals that you used to have in an organization. If you often had, breakfast together or a mid-morning break together, providing people with an opportunity to do that online. Trying to think about what are some of the great things about our culture that we might be able to preserve in an online environment. Those are ways to kind of improve and pick up employee morale. In terms of actually motivating employees to get work done, I get it. It can sometimes be a lot easier to sit on your couch and watch Netflix in your pajamas than to, produce work at this time. Check in with your employees, ask what they need to be able to produce, share what your expectations are. When relationships move from in-person to virtual, the underlying problems and conflicts that we had get exacerbated. So if you have like an issue with how much your employee is producing, you need them to produce more, you have to get that out in the air. You have to talk about it. You have to surface that.
All right. I think we're a bit over now. So final question, and we'll also send you the slides out to the participants, etc. But in many countries, I think we see Trump as of course the president, but also I think the media loves him because he's such a great story. Would you? I'm assuming there are other good examples of great leadership in the great America that you can put forward to us, so we don't only see Trump.
Certainly, I think Dr. Anthony Fauci has been kind of the voice of reason throughout this crisis. He's the one person who's saying, not when will the country reopen, but what is it going to take for the country to reopen? And I think that's the right question, the better question to be answering and to be asking. I look a lot to governors of the states who really have a lot of disproportionate power to say when their state will reopen. I think that, if you look at Gavin Newsom in California, Andrew Cuomo in New York, Ralph Northam here in Virginia, there are very diverse approaches to leading from a political standpoint through these crises. And I think that those are three who in my mind really are thinking about, from a utilitarian, what's best for everyone perspective. They're the ones who I would pick out as leaders who I think are helping keep everyone moving toward that goal of, how do we get through this? So those are some names that I would certainly look at. And then of course, obviously all of the healthcare workers who are doing such amazing work, they're kind of silent leaders through this, but every night when they go home tired and exhausted, I think about how much they've been doing. So there's a lot of great stories there as well.
All right. Thank you much. Hopefully you got some good takeaways from there. So thank you very much to you all, and hopefully we'll see you another time.